The year was 1878, a time when the southwestern territories existed as bloody battlegrounds between worlds colliding. For those who dared cross the sun-scorched landscapes of Apache country, the illusion of safe passage could shatter in an instant, replaced by merciless reality. This is the story of Isabella Blackwood, a child who witnessed her entire world burn before her innocent eyes, and the legendary warrior who found her when fate had abandoned her to the unforgiving desert. The blood on 6-year-old Isabella's hands had dried to a rusty brown, cracking in the lines of her small palms as she stumbled through the sparse chaparral under the relentless Arizona sun. Her once pristine blue dress, sewn specially for the journey to her new home in Santa Fe, was torn at the hem and stained with horrors no child should ever witness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days had passed since the attack. 3 days since she had crawled beneath the overturned stagecoach and pressed her tiny fist against her mouth to stifle her sobs as death claimed everyone she had ever loved. The setting sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape, painting the terrain in hues of gold and crimson that reminded her too much of what she was desperately trying to escape. Her dark brown curls hung in matted tangles around her face, her porcelain skin now angry with sunburn. The April evening brought a chill that cut through her tattered clothing, but Isabella barely noticed. Hunger and thirst had transformed into a hollow emptiness that made the world around her waver like a mirage. 3 days had passed since the Prescott-bound stagecoach, carrying 8 passengers, including Isabella and her father, had been ambushed in the pre-dawn hours as they crossed Coyote Pass. Isabella had been gathering wildflowers a short distance from where the coach had stopped to water the horses when the first shots rang out. The crack of rifles split the quiet dawn, followed by screams that would etch themselves permanently into her young mind. She had dropped to the ground instantly, an instinct born from 3 years of life in a frontier town, crawling through desert. Scrub away from the stagecoach, but not far enough to avoid witnessing the slaughter. Her father, Judge William Blackwood, had been the first to fall, his imposing frame crumpling as he attempted to reason with the attackers. Now, Isabella was alone in the Sonoran Desert, a place where the sky stretched endlessly above her, making her feel smaller with each passing hour. The knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance. She had pulled it from the belt of a fallen passenger after the attackers had left, the wooden handle too large for her small grip, but providing some tangible connection to the adult world that had abandoned her. She had taken what little she could from the massacre site, a small canteen half full of water now long gone, the knife, and her father's pocket watch, its gold case now dented and stained, the chain wrapped twice around her thin wrist. "Keep walking," she whispered to herself, her voice almost unrecognizable, parched and small. Papa said, "Always keep walking if lost." But walking toward what? Isabella had no clear destination, only the vague understanding that water meant life. In this merciless landscape, the stagecoach had been following the old trade route toward Fort McDowell, aiming to reach the Verde River crossing before nightfall. But in her panic and confusion after the attack, she had lost all sense of direction. Each step was becoming more difficult than the last. Her small leather shoes, designed for Boston cobblestones rather than desert terrain, offered no protection against the rock and cactus that tore at her feet with every painful step. The knife she carried was heavy in her small hand, but she refused to relinquish it, the weight somehow comforting against the vastness of her solitude. As night approached, Isabella sought shelter beneath a small overhang of rock, gathering what dry brush she could find to create some meager protection against the desert night chill and the creatures that hunted in darkness. Her hands moved mechanically, recalling the lessons from Henry. the kindly stable hand from back home who had taught her how proper pioneers made camp. The memory brought a fresh wave of grief that threatened to drown her. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the distant howl of coyotes and the constant gnawing fear that kept her heart racing. When dawn broke, Isabella forced herself to her feet despite the protests of her aching body. The morning was already warm, the sun appearing as a molten disk over the eastern mountains that promised another day of punishing heat. By midday, Isabella's pace had slowed to a stagger. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her vision blurring at the edges. She knew, in the way children sometimes grasp adult truths without fully understanding them, that she was dying. Still she pushed forward, following the shadow of a formation of rocks in hope it would lead to shelter from the climbing sun. It was during a moment of clarity in her increasingly disjointed thoughts that she spotted it. A thin plume of smoke, rising in the distance, barely visible against the shimmering horizon. Her heart leapt with a mixture of hope and terror. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant either salvation or danger. Isabella hesitated, debating whether to approach or avoid the smoke. Who might be waiting there? Friendly settlers, cavalry soldiers, or the very men who had attacked the stagecoach? Desperation won out over caution. She would die out here alone. That much was certain. Whatever waited by that fire couldn't be. Worse than the slow death that beckoned in the empty desert, she altered her course, heading toward the smoke with renewed purpose. Her mind, clouded by dehydration and exhaustion, filled the journey with ghostly images. Her father walking beside her, her mother, 3 years dead from influenza, calling her name from just beyond the next rise. Isabella stumbled forward, driven now by something beyond conscious thought. What she didn't notice were the eyes watching her. From a ridge nearly half a mile away, a solitary figure tracked her movement through the shimming heat haze. He had been following her trail for nearly a day, reading the story of her desperate flight in the disturbed earth and broken vegetation she left behind. Tahoka, known to white settlers as the Shadow, lowered his gaze from the horizon and frowned. The child was heading straight for a camp of border raiders, men whose reputation for brutality toward both Apache and white settlers alike was legendary among his people. She was walking from one death into another. He traced the scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a reminder of his last encounter with such men. Tahoka was Apache of the Chiricahua band, though he had spent much of the past 15 years moving between worlds, hunting, trading, occasionally serving as scout for the bluecoat soldiers when it suited the purposes of his people. He had been tracking a mountain lion when he discovered the massacre site 2 days earlier. The brutality of the attack had told him immediately it wasn't the work of his people or any other tribe he knew. The bodies had been stripped of valuables, but left, otherwise intact, sprawled in postures of terror and surprise. No Apache warrior would waste such resources or leave such obvious signs. This was the work of desperate men preying on travelers, using the convenient excuse of Indian attacks to cover their crimes. He had found the child's trail leading away. From the site, small footprints, uneven, clearly exhausted and frightened. Following her hadn't been a conscious decision, merely an extension of his curiosity and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Now, watching her stumble toward danger, Tahoka knew he had a choice to make. Leave her to her fate. After all, she was not his responsibility, not his people, or intervene in ways that could bring him only trouble. The desert wind continued to blow, hot and dry, washing away any easy answers, leaving only the hard truth that the child wouldn't survive another night alone in this unforgiving land. Tahoka stood, adjusted the Winchester rifle slung across his back, and began to move. Whatever decision he had just made, even he wasn't entirely sure of his reasons. But as the distance between them closed, he knew that both their fates had just become entangled in ways neither could yet understand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Isabella's vision blurred as she pushed forward through the sparse vegetation, the distant smoke her only beacon. In the gathering dusk, her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. The relentless sun had finally begun its descent, but the damage was done. Her skin burned, her lips cracked and bleeding, and a strange coldness had settled into her limbs despite the lingering heat. The small knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance, but she gripped it tighter as she approached what appeared to be a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixing with another scent that made her empty stomach clench painfully. Roasting meat. She paused at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of mesquite. Through the branches, she could make out 3 wagons arranged in a rough semicircle. 5 men moved about the camp, rough-looking figures in dusty clothing. A campfire blazed in the center, where something small, perhaps a rabbit, turned on. A crude spit. Isabella hesitated, doubt creeping in where desperation had led. There was something about these men that set off warnings in her mind. Their loud, coarse laughter carried to her hiding spot, along with fragments of conversation that made her skin crawl. Good haul from that coach, fine timepiece on the judge. Shame about the little girl, though. Probably dead in the desert by now. No matter. Next time we won't be so hasty. Alvarez says they're sending the payroll through next week. The blood in Isabella's veins turned to ice. These weren't potential saviors. These were the men who had murdered her father and the others. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound when her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk, but not before dislodging a cascade of dried leaves. One of the men turned toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp with suspicion. "Show yourself." Isabella froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The man started toward her hiding spot, joined by another who carried a rifle. She knew she should run, but her body refused to obey, trapped between fear and exhaustion. "Check it out, Rawlins," the second man ordered. "Probably just a coyote, but no sense taking chances." The man called Rawlins drew his pistol and advanced toward the mesquite where Isabella hid. In 20 more steps, he would discover her. In 30, she would be dead, or worse. A sharp whistling sound cut through the air, followed by a dull thud. Rawlins stopped abruptly, looking down at his chest in confusion. The shaft of an arrow protruded from between his ribs, its fletching trembling. With the impact, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood emerged, spilling down his chin before he crumpled to the ground. Pandemonium erupted in the camp. The remaining men scattered for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting conflicting orders. Another arrow flew from somewhere to Isabella's left, missing its target but sending the raiders into further disarray. "Apache!" one of them yelled. "Take cover!" Isabella remained motionless, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The raiders' attention was no longer on finding her, but on the new threat. She needed to move, to escape while they were distracted. But which way was safe? A strong hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. An arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward into the deeper shadows beyond the mesquite. "Be still, little one," a voice whispered in her ear, the English heavily accented but clear. "Or we both die." Isabella's instinct was to struggle, to fight against this new captor. But the sound of gunfire from the camp made her reconsider. Whoever held her had just killed one of the men responsible for the massacre. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not an enemy. She allowed herself to be carried deeper into the desert, the stranger moving in a low crouch, placing each foot with deliberate care to leave minimal sign of their passage. Only when they were several 100 yards from the camp did he set her down, crouching to examine her with critical eyes. Isabella got her first clear look at the man. He was tall with broad shoulders and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, partially covered by a faded cavalry scout's hat that seemed oddly out of place with his otherwise traditional appearance. A bow was slung across his back alongside a rifle of American make, but it was his eyes that held her attention, dark, intelligent, and currently regarding her with a mixture of wariness and assessment. A jagged scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, giving his otherwise handsome face a fearsome aspect. "They kill your family," he stated, rather than asked. "At Wagon Place 3 suns ago." Isabella nodded slowly, still gripping her knife tightly. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible, cracked and dry. "How did you know?" "Found dead. Saw your tracks." He gestured in the direction they had come. "Those men, bad men, not my people who attacked your wagon." "I know," Isabella whispered, her small voice wavering as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "I heard them talking." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Cannot stay here. They will search when they find courage again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out from the direction of the camp, followed by shouting. The raiders were regrouping, perhaps preparing to hunt down whoever had attacked them. Isabella swayed on her feet, the world spinning around her. The man moved with surprising speed, catching her before she could fall. "Too long without water, without rest," he observed, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "Need safe place." Despite her situation, despite everything, Isabella felt a flicker of fear as this stranger, this Apache warrior, lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a doll. But she lacked the strength to protest, and somewhere in her mind a voice whispered that if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. "What's your name?" she managed to ask, her voice thin and weak. The man looked down at her, something softening almost imperceptibly in his stern gaze. "Tahoka," he said. Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call Tahoka the Shadow." "I'm Isabella," she whispered, her eyes growing heavy as the last of her strength ebbed away. "Isabella Blackwood." The warrior nodded once, adjusting his grip as he began to move through the gathering darkness with silent efficiency. "Sleep, little one. The shadow will keep you safe now." As unconsciousness finally claimed her, Isabella's last thought was of how quickly everything could change, how thin the line between life and death, between enemy and ally, between past and future. In her dreams, the massacre played out again and again, but this time a figure watched from the shadows. A man with dark eyes and a scarred face, witnessing her survival with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Isabella woke to the gentle touch of water on her cracked lips. She opened her eyes, disoriented by the unfamiliar stone ceiling above her, illuminated by the soft glow of a small fire. Her throat burned with thirst, her body an atlas of pain she could barely comprehend. A shadow moved beside her, and memory returned in a violent rush. The stagecoach, her father's death, the endless desert, the men at the campfire, and finally the Apache warrior who had carried her away from death. "Drink slow," came the accented voice of her rescuer. "Too fast makes sickness." Isabella struggled to raise herself, but firm hands guided her back down. Tahoka held a water skin to her lips, allowing her just enough to moisten her parched mouth. Before pulling it away, she wanted to protest, to beg for more, but some rational part of her mind recognized the wisdom in his caution. "Where are we?" she managed after a moment, her voice a painful rasp. "Safe place," Tahoka replied. "Old dwelling of the people. No white man knows this place." As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Isabella realized they were in a small cave, its entrance partially concealed by hanging brush. A tiny fire burned in a stone-lined pit, the smoke finding its way out through some unseen chimney in the rock above. The cave floor had been swept clean, and she lay on a bed of soft grasses covered with what appeared to be a rabbit pelt. Tahoka himself sat cross-legged beside the fire, his movements economical, as he tended to what smelled like cooking meat. In the firelight, his copper skin gleamed, the scar on his face creating dramatic shadows that made him appear both fearsome and somehow ancient, despite his obvious strength and vitality. He wore buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt that had once been military issue, but had been modified with native quill work, and moccasins decorated with intricate beadwork. The cavalry scout's hat was now absent, his long black hair tied back with a leather thong. "How long have I slept?" Isabella asked, accepting another small sip of water when he offered it. "2 suns," he replied, studying her with those penetrating, dark eyes. "Fever came, then went. Strong spirit in small body." 2 days. Isabella tried to process this information through the fog still clouding her mind. 2 days since he had rescued her from the men who had killed her father. 2 days lost to fever and exhaustion. Tahoka moved a clay pot from the fire's edge and poured some of its contents into a crude wooden bowl. "Eat now. Strength returns with food." The broth was thin but savory, made from desert rabbit and wild onions. Isabella's hands trembled so badly that Tahoka had to hold the bowl for her, allowing her to sip carefully from its edge. The warm liquid spread through her hollow stomach, the first real nourishment she had received in nearly a week. "The men. From the camp?" she asked between sips. "Did they follow us?" Tahoka's expression hardened slightly. "Tried. Lost trail at river crossing. They hunt still, but in wrong direction." Relief washed over Isabella, followed immediately by a crushing wave of grief as the reality of her situation settled more firmly upon her small shoulders. She was alive, but utterly alone in the world. Her father was dead, her journey to Santa Fe, where she was to have lived with her father's sister whom she had never met, abruptly and violently ended. She had no home, no family, and her only protection was this stranger, whose people were feared throughout the territories. As if sensing the turmoil within her, Tahoka spoke again, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Little one carries heavy thoughts. Rest now. Tomorrow is time enough for deciding paths." Isabella wanted to argue, to demand answers about what would happen to her, but exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep, even as her mind raced with questions. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Tahoka adding small sticks to the fire, his scarred face impassive yet somehow reassuring in the flickering light. Dreams came to her in fragments, her father's voice calling her name, the crack of rifles, the feeling of falling endlessly through darkness. She woke with a small cry, tears streaming down her face. Dawn light filtered through the brush covering the cave entrance, painting the stone walls in soft gold. Tahoka was gone, but a water skin had been placed within easy reach, along with a handful of dried berries on a flat stone beside her bed. Isabella drank cautiously, remembering his warning about drinking too quickly, then nibbled at the berries, their tartness a sharp contrast to the lingering taste of fear in her mouth. She took stock of herself. Her dress was filthy and torn beyond repair, but someone, Tahoka presumably, had cleaned the worst of the blood and dirt from her face and hands. The blisters on her feet had been covered with some kind of poultice that smelled strongly of herbs and pine. Her father's pocket watch still hung from her wrist, its familiar weight a small comfort in this strange place. With care, Isabella pushed herself to a sitting position. Her head swam momentarily, but the dizziness passed. She was weak, but no longer at death's door. The cave was small, but meticulously organized. Weapons and tools hung from pegs driven into cracks in the rock wall, a Winchester rifle, a bow and quiver of arrows, several knives of different sizes, and what appeared to be a military-issue compass. A pack made of tanned hide rested against the far wall, its contents a mystery. Near the fire pit, cooking implements, the clay pot, a metal cup that looked like standard cavalry issue, and several wooden implements were arranged with precise care. It was the dwelling of a man who lived between worlds, carrying elements of both, but belonging fully to neither. The brush at the entrance rustled, and Tahoka ducked inside, carrying a brace of quail. He paused when he saw Isabella sitting up, assessing her with those penetrating eyes. "Good," he said finally. "Strength returns. Fever is gone." He moved to the fire pit, rekindling the embers with practiced efficiency. "How did you find me?" Isabella asked, the question that had been forming in her mind since she first awoke with any clarity. Tahoka worked in silence for a moment, preparing the birds for cooking with deft movements of a small knife. "Was tracking mountain lion," he said finally. "Found Stagecoach place, many dead. Bad sign, not Apache work, but white men would blame the people." He skewered the dressed quail on green wood sticks and positioned them over the growing flames. "Saw small tracks leading away, child tracks, followed." He glanced at her. "Not first time white child left to die in desert, usually too late when found." The implication was clear. He had expected to find her body, not a living child. "Why? Help me?" Isabella pressed. "You could have left me. I'm not your people." Something flickered in Tahoka's expression, too quick to interpret. "Child is child," he said simply. "Apache way is to protect children, even enemies' children." He turned, the quail over the fire. "But you not enemy, just child caught in bad place." Isabella considered this. In Boston, where she had lived until her mother's death 3 years ago, Indians were spoken of with a mixture of fear and contempt. Her father, more worldly than most, having served as a territorial judge for nearly a decade, had maintained that the native peoples were treated unjustly, but had warned her nonetheless to be wary. Yet here she was, alive solely because this Apache warrior had chosen to help her when he had every reason not to. "What will happen to me now?" she asked, the question that weighed most heavily on her young mind. Tahoka did not answer immediately, testing the quail with a practiced touch before removing them from the fire. He handed one to Isabella on its skewer, the meat hot and fragrant. "Eat first, then we talk of tomorrow." Isabella ate with care, the hot meat tender and flavorful compared to the broth and berries. Tahoka watched her with an assessing gaze, occasionally nodding approval when she took another bite. When she had eaten her fill, he took the skewer and tossed it into the fire. "Little one has no family now?" he asked. Isabella swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. "My mother died 3 winters ago. My father was taking me to his sister in Santa Fe. I've never met her." She twisted the watch chain around her finger. "I don't even know her address, only her name. Margaret Sullivan." Tahoka nodded thoughtfully. "Santa Fe is far, many dangers between here and there." He studied her face. "Army fort is closer, 2 days' ride. They take white children, send to proper place." Isabella felt a stab of fear at the thought. Fort McDowell had been their original destination before continuing to Santa Fe, but the fort represented an unknown future, perhaps an orphanage, or a long journey east to some distant relative she'd never met, and the men who had attacked. The Stagecoach had mentioned the fort, suggesting they operated in the area. What if they found her there? "Would they know about my aunt?" she asked. "Could they find her?" "Perhaps." Tahoka's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Army has ways to send messages, takes time." Isabella gathered her courage. "Could you take me to Santa Fe? I could tell my aunt what happened. She would reward you." Even as she said the words, She knew how impossible the request was. An Apache warrior traveling hundreds of miles with a white child would face danger from all sides. A hint of what might have been amusement touched Tahoka's eyes. Long journey, many white settlements between, shadow not welcome in such places. He gestured to his face, to the unmistakable markers of his heritage. White men shoot Apache who travels with white child. Think kidnapping. Reality settled heavily on Isabella's small shoulders. Of course he couldn't take her to Santa Fe. The very act of helping her had already put him at risk. If he were seen with her by soldiers or settlers, he would likely be killed without question, regardless of her protests. Then the fort, she said quietly, resignation in her young voice. You'll take me to the fort. Tahoka was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. There is another way, he said finally. More difficult. Requires courage. Isabella straightened, something in his tone kindling a small spark of hope. What way? My people summer camp in high mountains, sacred place, safe from army, from bad men like those who attacked your wagon. He pointed to the east, where the blue outline of mountains was just visible through the cave entrance. Chief Greyhawk is wise man, respects courage, even in white child, might help find way to send message to your father's sister. Isabella's heart raced. An Apache camp. The very idea would have terrified her a week ago, raised as she had been on stories of savage raids and merciless warriors. But those stories now seemed as distant and unreal as her life in Boston. The only reality was this cave, this man who had saved her when all others had abandoned her to die. Would they accept me? She asked, her voice small but steady. I'm not Apache. Not easy, Tahoka admitted. Some would fear, some would hate. Child of white judge brings danger. He studied her face. But Greyhawk lost daughter to white man's sickness many winters ago. Has soft heart for children without family. Isabella considered her options, such as they were. The fort represented the known world, but also unknown dangers. The Apache camp was utterly foreign, frightening in its alienness, but offered the protection of Tahoka, whom she had already begun to trust against all reason and training. If I go with you to your people, she said slowly, what happens then? Would I stay there forever? Something like approval flickered in Tahoka's eyes at her practical question. Path reveals itself one step at time, little one. First step is safety. Next step comes when first is taken. It wasn't an answer, not really, but Isabella understood instinctively that it was the only one he could give. The future was uncertain. For both of them. When would we leave? She asked, decision taking shape in her mind. When strength returns enough for journey. 2 sons, maybe 3. Tahoka assessed her with a critical eye. Need better clothes. Desert burns white skin too easily. He reached for his pack and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in tanned hide. Made these while you slept. Inside the bundle, Isabella found a child-sized buckskin shirt decorated with simple quillwork, a pair of soft leather leggings, and tiny moccasins that would replace her ruined shoes. The craftsmanship was rough but effective, clearly made with haste but considerable. Skill. Tomorrow you try, Tahoka said. Today rest more, build strength. He moved to the cave entrance, scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. Shadow must hunt. Check for bad men tracks. Stay here. Drink water. Sleep. With that, he was gone, slipping through the brush covering with barely a sound, leaving Isabella alone, with her thoughts and the small bundle of clothing that represented her first step into an unknown future. The day passed slowly. Isabella drifted in and out of sleep, her body still recovering from the ordeal it had endured. When awake, she examined the clothing Tahoka had made, marveling at the practical design so different from the restrictive dresses she was accustomed to wearing. The buckskin was soft and supple, the quillwork creating simple geometric patterns along the collar and sleeves. It occurred to her that no one in her former life would recognize her dressed in such garments. The thought brought a strange mixture of sadness and something else, a tentative sense of possibility. By the time Tahoka returned as the sun was setting, Isabella had made her decision. She would go with him to the Apache camp. It was a choice born of necessity, but also of an instinctive trust in this solemn warrior who had no reason to help her but had done so anyway. Tahoka brought water from a nearby spring and more game. A desert hare this time, which he prepared with the same efficient movements as before. As they shared the meal, Isabella studied him with newfound curiosity. "Why do they call you the Shadow?" she asked. The question seemed to surprise him slightly. "Move silent," he replied after a moment. "Come and go like shadow. Good scout. Good hunter." A hint of pride touched his voice. "Enemy never sees shadow until too late. You were a scout for the army?" Isabella asked, remembering the cavalry hat and other military items among his possessions. Tahoka nodded. 5 winters. Tracked Apache who raided settlements. Tracked Comanche who fought Apache. Tracked deserters who stole from both. His expression grew distant. "Learned white man's ways, learned white man's tongue, useful knowledge, but you left," Isabella observed. "It wasn't a question. Army wants Apache to become white inside. Forget old ways." He touched a small pouch that hung at his belt, decorated with intricate beadwork. "Some ways should not be forgotten." Isabella thought of her own education at the ladies' seminary in Boston, where she had been taught that civilization was a gift being bestowed upon the savage races. Now, facing the reality of the frontier, she wondered which world was truly savage. "Did you have a family?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. Tahoka's face stilled, and for a moment Isabella feared she had angered him. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, if touched with a sorrow that seemed to run deeper than words could express. "Had wife, son." His fingers unconsciously moved to the scar on his face. "Raid came while Shadow was scouting for bluecoats. Settlers. From North Valley, said Apache stole cattle." His jaw tightened. "No stolen cattle, just fear, hate." Isabella's heart contracted painfully in her chest. "They killed your family? Wife, son, brother, mother. 15 summers ago." His gaze met. Hers across the fire, pain and understanding bridging the vast gulf of their different worlds. Shadow knows what little one feels. Empty place inside that never fills. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, not just for her own loss, but for his. She had not expected this connection, this shared grief that transcended the boundaries of age and culture. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she whispered. Tahoka considered her question with the same gravity he seemed to apply to everything. "Pain changes," he said finally, "like river changes course after flood. Still flows, but finds new path." He added a small stick to the fire. "You find path too, little one. Path begins tomorrow. Sleep now. Journey waits with dawn." Isabella lay back on her bed of grasses, her mind filled with all she had learned. As sleep began to claim her once more, she realized that for the first time since the attack, she wasn't consumed by fear. Uncertainty remained, and grief still sat heavily in her chest, but something else had taken root alongside them. A fragile, tentative trust in the scarred warrior who called himself the Shadow, and perhaps an even more fragile hope for what tomorrow might bring. Outside the hidden cave, night settled over the desert, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky. Coyotes called in the distance, their eerie songs floating on the cool air, and somewhere to the east, In the mountains barely visible on the horizon lay the summer camp of Tahoka's people and Isabella's uncertain future. Dawn broke with pale fingers of light stretching across the desert landscape. Isabella awakened to find Tahoka already preparing for their departure, his movements swift and deliberate as he packed dried meat and a water skin into a small hide pouch. "Try clothes," he said, gesturing to the buckskin outfit he had made. "Journey begins soon." Isabella slipped behind a natural partition in the cave wall and changed from her ruined dress into the Apache garments. The leather felt strange against her skin, softer than expected, yet sturdy. The leggings and moccasins fit remarkably well, and the shirt, though loose, provided far more freedom of movement than her former clothing. When she emerged, Tahoka nodded approval, his expression revealing a hint of pride in his craftsmanship. "Good. Now sun will not burn white skin so quickly." He approached and placed a wide-brimmed hat, a smaller version of his own cavalry scout's hat, on her head. "Found this at trading post many moons ago. Too small for Shadow. Right size for little one." Isabella touched the hat with wonder. It was worn but serviceable, and when she glanced down at herself, she realized the transformation was complete. Nothing remained of the Boston judge's daughter who had boarded the stagecoach a week ago. In her place stood a strange hybrid, a white child in Apache clothing, poised between worlds just as surely as her rescuer. "Keep this," Tahoka said, handing her a small knife in a beaded sheath. "Danger follows us. Apache child learns to protect self early." Isabella accepted the knife solemnly, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not merely practical protection, but an acknowledgement of her new status. She was no longer simply a helpless victim to be rescued, but someone expected to contribute to her own survival. They departed as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, Tahoka leading a paint horse he had apparently kept hidden nearby. He lifted Isabella onto the animal's back and took the reins, guiding the horse on foot through the rocky terrain that surrounded the cave. "Why don't you ride?" Isabella asked, feeling awkward seated while her protector walked. "Horse leaves tracks," Tahoka explained, gesturing to the rocky ground. "Shadow's moccasins leave less sign. Men still hunt us. Must be careful until reach mountains." The desert gradually gave way to scattered juniper and pinyon pine as they gained elevation, making their way toward the distant mountains. Tahoka maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to listen or to examine the ground for signs Isabella could not perceive. Each time they rested in the shade of a boulder or tree, he taught her something new: how to identify which plants held water, how to recognize the tracks of animals and men, how to move quietly across different terrain. By midday, they had entered true foothills, the landscape becoming increasingly vertical. The air cooled noticeably, and Isabella marveled at how quickly the environment changed with elevation. When they stopped to rest and eat dried meat beside a small spring, she noticed Tahoka growing increasingly alert, his eyes scanning the slopes, above with heightened vigilance. "Something wrong?" she asked, instinctively keeping her voice low. "Not sure," he replied, testing the wind with a wetted finger. "Feel eyes watching." Isabella's heart quickened. "The men from the stagecoach," Tahoka shook his head slightly. "Different. Could be mountain lion, could be Apache scouts." "Your people, perhaps." His expression remained guarded. "Not all Apaches same. Different bands. Some friends to Shadows. People. Some not." He stood, deciding their rest was finished. "Stay close now. Speak only when needed." Their path grew steeper, following game trails that zigzagged up increasingly rough terrain. When the way became too difficult for the horse, Tahoka lifted Isabella onto his shoulders with surprising strength, carrying her across boulder fields and up near vertical slopes that would have been impossible for her to navigate alone. Late, In the afternoon, they reached a narrow pass between two towering formations of red rock. Tahoka stopped abruptly, setting Isabella down and motioning for her to remain still. His hand moved to his knife, and his posture shifted subtly into what she recognized as readiness for conflict. Three figures materialized from the shadows of the rock formations. Apache warriors with painted faces, each holding a bow with an arrow nocked but not yet drawn. Their expressions were stern, unwelcoming. The tallest of them spoke sharply in Apache, his tone clearly challenging. Tahoka replied calmly in the same language, one hand slightly raised in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture, the other remaining near his knife. The exchange continued, growing more heated as the tall warrior repeatedly gestured toward Isabella. With obvious displeasure, though she couldn't understand the words, Isabella grasped the situation with clarity beyond her years. Her presence was unwelcome, potentially dangerous to the Apache. She was, after all, a white child, the daughter of a territorial judge. Her very existence among them could bring soldiers searching, regardless of the circumstances. Acting on instinct rather than any conscious plan, Isabella stepped forward and spoke directly to the tall warrior, lifting her chin with determined dignity despite her small stature. "My name is Isabella Blackwood," she said clearly. "The shadow saved me when all others left me to die. I have no one else now." The three warriors looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting the white child to address them directly. The tall one replied in broken English, his tone marginally less hostile. "Why white child comes to Apache land? Brings soldiers, brings trouble." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "Bad men killed my father. The same bad men who blame their evil on your people. The shadow killed one of them to save me." A flicker of interest crossed the warrior's face. He spoke rapidly to Tahoka, who responded with equal intensity, occasionally gesturing toward Isabella or the distant desert they had traversed. After what seemed an eternity of discussion, the tall warrior nodded once. Apparently coming to a decision, he turned to Isabella again. "You come. Council must hear this." His eyes narrowed in warning, but eyes covered. "No white child sees path to summer camp." Tahoka moved to her side. "They take us to Grey Hawk. Better outcome than I hoped." He produced a strip of soft hide from his belt pouch. "Must cover eyes now. I carry you, trust shadow." Isabella nodded, closing her eyes as he tied the blindfold securely. The world plunged into darkness, heightening her other senses, the scent of pine and dust, the sound of wind through stone crevices, the murmur of voices in a language she couldn't understand. She felt Tahoka's strong hands lift her, settling her against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. They began to move, following what felt like an increasingly complex path of sharp turns, steep climbs, and occasional descents. The journey in darkness seemed endless, disorienting without visual references to mark time or distance. Eventually, the sounds around them changed. Children's voices raised in play, dogs barking, the rhythm of work and life. They had reached the Apache summer camp. Isabella felt Tahoka set her down carefully, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her on the unfamiliar ground. "Ready?" he asked quietly near her ear. Isabella nodded, her throat too dry for words. The blindfold was removed, and she blinked against the late afternoon sunlight, taking in her surroundings. The Apache summer camp spread before her in a sheltered valley nestled high in the mountains. Perhaps 30 wickiups arranged in a semicircle, some constructed of brush and hides, others more permanent structures of saplings and bark. Cook fires flickered throughout the camp, sending thin columns of smoke into the clear mountain air. Children paused in their play to stare at the newcomers. Women stood from their work with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility, and men approached with hands resting on weapons. Tahoka stood tall beside her, his face composed, but alert. The three warriors who had escorted them moved. Ahead, calling out to the gathering crowd, a ripple of reaction passed through the assembly: surprise, anger, suspicion. A path cleared through the people as an elderly man emerged from the largest wickiup near the center of the camp. His face was deeply lined with age, his long grey hair adorned with a single eagle feather. Despite his years, he moved with the straight-backed dignity of one accustomed to authority. "Chief Greyhawk," Tahoka said under his breath. "Show respect. Do not speak until spoken to." The chief approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Isabella's appearance: the Apache clothing, the hat, the small knife at her belt, the mixture of fear and determination in her posture. He spoke in Apache to Tahoka, who responded at length, occasionally gesturing toward Isabella or in the direction from which they had traveled. Isabella stood silently, acutely aware of the stares from all sides. Children whispered behind their hands, nudged by mothers into silence. Young warriors watched with undisguised suspicion. A few of the older women studied her with expressions that seemed more calculating than hostile. Finally, Chief Greyhawk turned his attention fully to Isabella, addressing her in halting but understandable English. "Shadow says you survive when all others die. Says you see truth of who kills your father." "Yes," Isabella replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite her fear. "It was white men, raiders pretending to be Indians. They've been attacking both white travelers and native villages, stirring hatred between our peoples." The chief's weathered face remained impassive. "Why should we believe white child's words? White tongues often speak lies about Apache." Isabella felt the weight of every eye upon her. This moment, her response would determine not just her welcome, but possibly her survival. Her fingers found her father's pocket watch, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "I have no reason to lie," she said. "I've lost everything. My father, my home, my future in Santa Fe. The men who destroyed all that are still out there, free to continue their crimes against both our peoples." She met the chief's penetrating gaze directly. "The truth is all I have left." Greyhawk studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and spoke at length to a small group of older men who had gathered behind him. Council members, Isabella guessed by their attentive posture and the respect shown to them by others. One of them, a man with deeply lined features and one arm missing below the elbow, spoke forcefully, gesturing toward Isabella with obvious disapproval. Another, wearing an elaborate necklace of bear claws, seemed to argue in her favor, pointing to Tahoka with what appeared to be words of support. The debate continued as twilight descended over the camp. More torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across the gathered faces. Isabella stood motionless beside Tahoka, determined not to show the exhaustion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, Chief Greyhawk raised his hand, silencing the council's discussion. He turned back to Isabella and Tahoka. "Child will stay," he announced. 3 days. Council hears the full story tomorrow when minds rested. With that, he turned and walked back toward the central wickiup, the council members following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, though many continued to cast curious or hostile glances toward Isabella. Tahoka let out a small breath. "Good outcome," he said quietly. "Better than expected." The tall warrior who had escorted them to the camp approached, speaking briefly to Tahoka before pointing toward a small wickiup at the edge of the settlement. Tahoka nodded in acknowledgement, then placed a gentle hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Come, we sleep there tonight. Tomorrow you tell your story to council." As they crossed the camp toward their designated shelter, Isabella felt dozens of eyes following their progress. A young Apache girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, darted into their path, staring openly at Isabella with undisguised curiosity. An older woman, her mother presumably, called sharply, pulling the child away with a distrustful glance at the white intruder. The small wickiup was sparsely furnished. 2 sleeping pallets of pine boughs covered with hides, a central fire, a few clay vessels for water. A young woman entered shortly after them, silently placing a wooden bowl of stew near the fire before departing without meeting Isabella's eyes. "Who was that?" Isabella asked, sinking gratefully onto one of the pallets as her legs finally gave. "Way beneath her, Rising Star, daughter of Greyhawk's son," Tahoka explained, sitting across from her. "She is curious about you, but Apache way is to watch without seeming to watch." Isabella managed a tired smile at that. "Like you watched me in the desert before you decided to help me." This drew a small nod from Tahoka, a rare acknowledgement of amusement. The brief moment of lightness felt precious amid the tension of their situation. They ate the stew, a rich mixture of venison, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots, in companionable silence. Isabella found herself studying the interior of the wickiup, noting the craftsmanship of the structure, the practical arrangement of the sparse belongings. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked finally. "Council meets. You tell story, full story, every detail?" Tahoka's expression grew serious. "Important to remember everything exactly. Small differences cause suspicion." "And if they decide I'm lying?" Isabella asked quietly. Tahoka didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "Sleep," he said instead. "Need strength for tomorrow." Isabella lay down on the buffalo robe, its musky scent oddly comforting after days in the wilderness. Exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind raced with anxiety about the coming day. Her testimony before the council would determine not just her fate, but potentially her entire future. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of how quickly her world had changed. From Boston society to territorial judge's daughter to lone survivor to a white child in an Apache camp. Her life now dependent on her ability to convince a council of elders to believe her truth. Morning arrived with the scent of pine carried on a cool mountain breeze. Isabella woke to find Rising Star waiting silently beside her pallet, a small, wooden bowl of steaming liquid in her hands. The Apache girl's dark eyes revealed a mixture of wariness and undeniable curiosity as she offered the bowl to Isabella. "Drink," she said in careful English. "Makes heart strong for council." Isabella sat up and accepted the offering with a grateful nod. The tea was bitter but bracing, clearing the fog of sleep from her mind. As she sipped, she noticed that Tahoka was absent from the wickiup. "Where is the shadow?" she asked. Rising Star made a vague gesture toward the center of the camp. "Speaks with elders, prepares way." She tilted her head, studying Isabella with the direct gaze of youth. "Why white girl has Apache knife?" Isabella glanced down at the small sheathed blade Tahoka had given her. "The shadow gave it to me, for protection." The answer seemed to surprise Rising Star, who frowned slightly before asking, "You know how to use?" "Not really," Isabella admitted. "My father never allowed me to handle knives except at meals." Rising Star's expression shifted to one of disbelief, bordering on pity. How white girls survive without knife skills? Even small children of the people learn blade ways. Before Isabella could respond, the hide covering the wickiup entrance was pushed aside, and an elderly woman entered. Her face was deeply lined with age. Her silver hair, arranged in 2 long braids adorned with small beads. She spoke sharply to Rising Star in Apache, clearly displeased at finding her conversing with the white intruder. Rising Star responded with respectful deference, though Isabella detected a hint of rebellion in her tone. The older woman turned her attention to Isabella, her gaze critical but not entirely hostile as she assessed the young girl from head to toe. "Grandmother says white child must be prepared for council." Rising Star translated. Cannot appear before. Greyhawk looking like lost coyote pup. The elderly woman, apparently Rising Star's grandmother, approached Isabella and gestured for her to stand. Despite her age, her hands were sure and strong as she adjusted Isabella's buckskin shirt, smoothed her hair, and examined the poultice on her healing feet. She spoke continuously in Apache, her tone authoritative. Grandmother says you speak. With strength today, Rising Star explained as the older woman worked. Look warriors in eye. Show no fear. Council respects courage, even in enemy. I'm not an enemy, Isabella protested. The old woman's eyes flickered to Isabella's face when she heard the English words, though she gave no other indication of understanding. All whites are enemies to some Apache, Rising Star said simply. But grandmother knows mountain lion and rattlesnake, both dangerous yet different. Says wise one looks beyond the skin to the spirit beneath. When the older woman finished her ministrations, Isabella's appearance had been subtly transformed. Her hair was neatly braided with a small feather woven into the plait. Her clothing properly arranged, a bit of red ochre rubbed into her cheeks to bring color to her sun-reddened face. The elderly woman stepped back, nodded once in apparent satisfaction, and turned to leave. At the entrance, she paused and spoke directly to Isabella, her voice strong despite her years. Grandmother says tell truth with straight tongue. Rising Star translated, says Chief Greyhawk sees lies like eagle sees mouse in high grass. With that cryptic advice, the old woman departed, leaving Isabella feeling oddly bolstered by the unexpected assistance. Rising Star remained, watching Isabella with unabashed interest. Your grandmother doesn't seem to hate me, Isabella observed. Rising Star shrugged. Grandmother is morning sky, medicine woman of our band, sees many things others cannot. She hesitated, then added, saw you in dream before you came, said child of two worlds, walks dangerous path into our circle. Before Isabella could inquire further about this unsettling revelation, Tahoka appeared at the entrance. His expression was grave, his bearing formal in a way she hadn't seen before. He wore a clean buckskin shirt adorned with more elaborate beadwork than his traveling clothes, and a single eagle feather was fastened in his hair. Council gathers, he said simply. Time to speak your truth. Rising Star slipped past him with a respectful nod, disappearing into the busy camp beyond. Isabella took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. I'm ready, she said, though her stomach tightened with apprehension. Tahoka studied her appearance, noticing the changes. Morning sky helped prepare you, he observed. Good sign. Her voice carries weight with Greyhawk. They walked together through the camp, which hummed with activity in the morning light. Women worked at cooking fires or scraped hides stretched on wooden frames. Children darted between wiki-ups in games of chase, occasionally pausing to stare. At the white girl, walking beside the shadow, warriors gathered in small groups, their conversations falling silent as Isabella passed. The council lodge stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others and marked by painted symbols on its exterior. As Isabella approached, flanked by Tahoka, she could see that a significant gathering had already assembled inside. The morning sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top, casting dappled patterns across the assembled faces. Chief Greyhawk sat at the head of the circle, his weathered face impassive. To his right was the one-armed elder who had argued against her the previous evening, his expression stern and unwelcoming. To his left sat the man with the bear-claw necklace who had spoken in her favor, his eyes thoughtful as he observed her. Entrance, come forward, Greyhawk instructed, gesturing to the center of the circle. Sit here. Isabella took her place on the woven mat indicated, conscious of the many eyes upon her. Women of the tribe had gathered at the periphery of the lodge, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Among them she spotted Morning Sky, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, and Rising Star, who watched with undisguised fascination. Tahoka remained standing near the entrance, his posture formal, face carefully neutral. He did not acknowledge her directly, but his presence provided a measure of reassurance. "You claim to witness attack on white man's wagon," Greyhawk began without preamble. "Tell us what you saw, every detail from beginning." Isabella took a deep breath, centering herself. This was perhaps the most important story she would ever tell. Lives, both Apache and white, might depend on her ability to convey the truth convincingly. "We were traveling in a stagecoach bound for Fort McDowell," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "8 passengers, including my father, Judge William Blackwood, and myself. We left Tucson 5 days ago." She described the journey. The crossing of dry riverbeds, the gradual shift in landscape as they entered the territory the driver had warned was Apache country. The council listened silently, neither encouraging nor interrupting her narrative. "3 mornings ago, just before dawn, I wandered a short distance from where the stagecoach had stopped to water the horses," Isabella continued, forcing herself to relive the terrible moments she had been trying to forget. "I was gathering wildflowers near a stand of mesquite when I heard the first shots." Her voice remained steady as she recounted the horror of what followed. Hiding in the desert brush, watching as the attackers systematically murdered the members of the stagecoach party, she described the men in detail. Their clothing, their weapons, the way they moved and spoke. They were white men, she emphasized. Some had tied strips of cloth with beadwork to their arms, and one wore what looked like Apache moccasins, but it was clearly false, a disguise. They spoke English to each other and used white men's curses. The one-armed elder leaned forward. "How you survive when all others die?" "I was already away from the coach when the attack began," Isabella explained. "I hid in the brush, then under a large rock outcropping. They were careless, confident no one had escaped, more interested in looting than searching thoroughly." She described her 3 days alone, the desperate flight through unfamiliar terrain, finally encountering the same men at their camp. "I heard them talking," she said, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "They spoke of the good haul from the stagecoach. One mentioned my father's gold pocket watch. Another said they should check Fort McDowell in a few days, that the army was sending a payroll through." She touched the watch at her belt. "They were the same men who attacked us, not Apache, as they wanted it to appear." The council members exchanged glances. The man with the bear claw necklace spoke in Apache to Greyhawk, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Isabella. "These men, you know who they are?" Isabella shook her head. "I never saw them before the attack, but they seemed familiar with the territory. Their leader was called Vance, a tall man with a red beard and a burn scar on his right hand. The reaction among the council was immediate and electric. Several elders spoke at once, their tone urgent. Greyhawk raised his hand for silence, his expression darkening. "Vance Blackburn," he said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "Trades guns to Apache enemies, steals horses from Apache friends, kills both when it serves his purpose. He leads attacks on settlements, then blames the people," added the Bearclaw elder in heavily accented English. "Army sends soldiers. Innocent Apache die." The one-armed elder spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing emphatically, though Isabella couldn't understand his words. The meaning was clear. He remained unconvinced, suspicious of her account. "Stone Arm asks why we should believe you," Greyhawk translated. "Says white child would say anything to save herself." Isabella felt a surge of frustration but kept her voice measured. "If I wanted to blame your people for the massacre, I would have continued alone toward Fort McDowell. I would not be here among you, telling a story that places blame on my own kind." This caused a murmur among the gathered council. The logic of her argument was difficult to refute. "There is more," Tahoka said, stepping forward slightly. Child could have gone with blue-coat soldiers when we saw their dust on horizon. Chose to continue with Shadow instead. Chose truth over easy path. Stone Arm spoke again, his tone challenging. Tahoka responded with equal intensity, and soon multiple voices joined the debate, the Apache language flowing too rapidly for Isabella to follow any of it. Greyhawk raised his hand, silencing the council. One more question, he said to Isabella. These men who attack, how many? 5 that I saw clearly, she replied. There may have been more. Where did they camp when you found them? Isabella closed her eyes briefly, recalling the details of the raiders' camp, in a small valley with 3 large red rock formations, like fingers pointing to the sky. There was a spring with cottonwood trees. They had 3 wagons arranged in a half-circle. A shocked silence fell over the council. Isabella opened her eyes to find every face staring at her with new intensity. You know this place, she said, slowly recognizing the reaction. Greyhawk exchanged glances with the other elders before answering. Place you describe is Red Finger Valley, sacred to some Apache bands. Place where Blackburn and his men have camp often. His eyes narrowed. How many days' ride from where Shadow found you? I'm not sure, Isabella admitted. I was lost for 3 days before he found me. 2 days' ride southwest, Tahoka interjected, near the Traders' Road to Fort McDowell. Greyhawk nodded, then spoke at length to the council. The debate resumed with new urgency, voices rising and falling as various elders presented their views. Isabella watched their faces, wishing she could understand their words, but reading much in their expressions and gestures. Morning Sky, who had remained silent at the periphery, suddenly stepped forward and addressed the council. Her voice was strong despite her age, her words measured and deliberate. The other elders listened with obvious respect, even Stone Arm falling silent. As she spoke, when she finished, Greyhawk nodded slowly, then turned back to Isabella. Medicine Woman says your spirit speaks truth, even when your tongue lacks our words, he announced. Council agrees Blackburn is enemy to both peoples. Relief washed through Isabella, so profound she felt momentarily dizzy. They believed her. The truth had been heard. What happens now, she asked, the question that had weighed on her since her arrival. Greyhawk's expression remained grave. Blackburn and his men still hunt. They know Child escapes. No Child is. Witness, he gestured around the circle. No Apache protects Child. This brings danger to the people. The implications settled heavily on Isabella's small shoulders. Her very presence put the camp at risk. If Blackburn's men were still searching for her, if they somehow discovered her whereabouts, I should leave, she said quietly, resignation in her young voice. I don't want to bring harm to those who helped me. An approving murmur passed through the assembly at her words. Even Stone Arm's stern expression softened slightly. Greyhawk studied her for a moment before speaking. Courage speaks in Child's voice, he observed. But where would you go? Fort brings different dangers. Blackburn has friends among bluecoats. Message to your father's sister takes many moons to reach Santa Fe. Isabella hadn't considered this. Fort McDowell had seemed the logical destination, but if Blackburn had connections there, she might be delivering herself directly into the hands of her enemies. Tahoka stepped forward. There is another path, he said, addressing Greyhawk directly. White Man's trading post at Oak Creek Canyon. Trader Wilson has no love for Blackburn, has sent messages to Army before about raiders, might help send word to Child's aunt in Santa Fe. The council stirred at this suggestion, various members offering opinions in rapid Apache. Greyhawk listened, his expression thoughtful, occasionally nodding or asking a brief question. Council will consider this path, he announced finally. Until decision is made, Child stays in camp. His gaze was penetrating as he addressed Isabella directly. Learn our ways. Show if you truly stand for truth or only for your own survival. With that, the council session ended. The elders rose, filing out of the lodge with measured dignity. The women followed, many casting curious glances at Isabella as they departed. Morning Sky paused briefly beside her, placing a gnarled hand on her head in what felt like a blessing before moving on. Tahoka approached as the lodge emptied. "You did well," he said quietly. "Council rarely believes outsider so quickly." "What happens now?" Isabella asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional strain of reliving the massacre and facing the council. "Now we wait. Council debates, decides." He offered his hand to help her rise from the mat, "And you learn what it means to live among Apache." As they stepped outside into the bright midday sun, Rising Star was waiting, clearly having been instructed to attend to the white child. She approached Isabella with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Come," she said simply. "Grandmother says you learn Apache ways now." Isabella glanced at Tahoka, who nodded encouragement. "Go with Rising Star. Shadow has duties with warriors. We'll return before sun sleeps." As Tahoka walked away toward a group of waiting warriors, Isabella realized that a new chapter of her journey was beginning. The testimony was over, her immediate future decided. But the greater challenge, finding her place in this unfamiliar world, was just beginning. Rising Star beckoned impatiently. "Come, much to learn. Grandmother says white hands must learn useful work, or spirits grow restless." With a deep breath, Isabella followed the Apache girl into the bustling life of the camp, stepping further into a world she could never have imagined from the sheltered confines of her Boston childhood. 2 weeks passed in the Apache summer camp, transforming Isabella in ways that would have been unimaginable to the proper Boston girl who had boarded the Stagecoach with her father. Her pale skin had darkened to a golden tan, her hands had grown calloused from daily work, and her once awkward movements had developed a measure of the natural grace that characterized the Apache children. Under Morning Sky's stern but patient tutelage, she had learned to weave simple baskets, to prepare hides for tanning, to identify edible plants, and to move silently through the forest. Rising Star had become both teacher and companion, initially skeptical of the white girl's abilities, but gradually warming as Isabella demonstrated a willingness to learn that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The warriors, still, regarded her with caution, and some of the women maintained their distance, but the open hostility had largely faded as Isabella proved herself neither a burden nor a threat. The children had been the quickest to accept her, incorporating her into their games with the effortless adaptability of youth. Through it all, Tahoka remained a steady presence, though often absent from camp on hunting or scouting expeditions. When present, he continued Isabella's education in wilderness skills, teaching her to track small game, to move without leaving sign, to interpret the myriad sounds of the forest. His approval, rare but genuine, became something she valued above almost anything in her new life. On this particular morning, Isabella knelt beside a stream that ran near the camp, carefully cleaning a rabbit she had snared herself for the first time. Rising Star watched critically, occasionally offering guidance in the mixture of broken English and Apache phrases that had become their common language. "Cut there," Rising Star instructed, pointing to a spot between the rabbit's ribs. Careful, with gall bladder, bitter taste ruins meat. Isabella worked with deliberate care, her small knife, once awkward in her grip, now an extension of her hand. The rabbit had been her first successful hunt, and pride warmed her chest despite the gruesome task of preparing it. "Your grandmother will be surprised," Isabella said, glancing up at her companion with a small smile. Rising Star shrugged, but a hint of answering pride showed in her eyes. "Morning Sky says white girl learns quickly for one who never held knife." Says you have Apache spirit in pale skin. Coming from the medicine woman, this was high praise indeed. Isabella had come to respect Morning Sky deeply, recognizing the wisdom and strength in the elderly healer who had taken a white child under her protection despite the misgivings of many in the tribe. As they finished cleaning the rabbit and gathered their materials to return to camp, a distant whistle sounded from the ridge above. 3 short notes followed by a longer call. Rising Star stiffened, her expression shifting instantly from casual to alert. "Scout signal," she said quickly, gathering the rabbit and their tools. "Someone comes, we return to camp now." They hurried back along the path, joining others who were converging on the central clearing. Warriors emerged from wiki-ups with weapons in hand, and women gathered children close, the camp transforming from peaceful routine to wary readiness. In moments, Chief Greyhawk stood at the center of the gathering, Tahoka and the Bearclaw elder, Swiftwater, beside him. A young scout, barely older than a boy, was speaking rapidly, gesturing toward the southern approach to the camp. Isabella spotted Morning Sky near the chief's circle and moved to join her, Rising Star following close behind. The medicine woman acknowledged their arrival with a brief nod, her face grave as she listened to the scout's report. "What happens?" Isabella asked quietly. "Blue-coat soldiers," Morning Sky replied in her halting English. 2 days' ride from here. Many horses, many guns." A chill ran through Isabella despite the summer heat. Soldiers would ordinarily represent safety to a white child, but her world had shifted profoundly in the past weeks. Now they symbolized a threat to the people who had sheltered her, who had become, against all expectation, something like a second family. "Looking for me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Morning Sky's expression revealed nothing. Perhaps not. Greyhawk decides soon. The council gathered quickly in the chief's lodge, elders filing in with solemn faces. Tahoka approached Isabella before joining them, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Soldiers come from Fort McDowell," he said quietly. "Ask questions at trading posts about missing white child from Stagecoach massacre." Isabella's heart raced. "They know I survived," someone tells them. Tahoka's jaw tightened. "Maybe Blackburn. Maybe others." Scout says soldiers speak of Apache kidnapping, say they search for Judge's daughter taken by savages. The implications were clear and ominous. If soldiers believed she had been kidnapped rather than rescued, they would come with violence in mind, seeking to punish rather than understand. The Apache camp would be at risk of becoming another tragic battlefield in the long conflict between worlds. "I have to go to them," Isabella said, the words almost painful to speak. "I have to tell them the truth before they reach the camp." Tahoka studied her face, searching for something in her expression. "Council decides now, wait here." He disappeared into the chief's lodge, leaving Isabella with Morning Sky and Rising Star, anxiety building with each passing moment. Around them, the camp prepared for potential conflict, weapons checked, essential belongings packed, women preparing for possible evacuation with the efficiency born of generations living under threat. When the council emerged an hour later, Isabella could read the decision in their grim faces before a word was spoken. Greyhawk approached her directly, his weathered face solemn but not unkind. "White soldiers come with many guns, many lies in hearts," he said. "Say Apache warrior steals white judge's child, kills white travelers, bring war to our people." Isabella's throat tightened. "I can tell them the truth, that the shadow saved me, that Blackburn's men were responsible for the attack." Greyhawk shook his head slowly. "Bluecoats not listen to child who lives with savages. See only what they expect to see." He glanced at Tahoka. "Shadow says you must go before soldiers find camp. Meet them on trail. Tell your story there." The wisdom of this plan was undeniable, yet it felt like a painful tearing. To leave the camp, to return to the white world, even temporarily, seemed suddenly like exile rather than rescue. "I'll go," she said, lifting her chin with determination that had become characteristic since her arrival. "But I need someone to guide me, to make sure I reach the soldiers safely." "Shadow takes you," Greyhawk confirmed. "Knows soldiers, knows their ways. Can speak if needed, then return to people." His dark eyes held hers with unexpected gentleness. "Child has found place in Apache Circle. Circle remains open when truth is told." The implication sent a wave of emotion through Isabella. She was not being sent away permanently. The door would remain open for her return. The realization was both comforting and confusing. She had an aunt waiting in Santa Fe, a place in the white world that was her birthright. Yet the thought of leaving the Apache camp permanently created an ache she hadn't anticipated. Preparations moved swiftly after the decision was made. Tahoka would guide Isabella to intercept the soldiers on the trail the following day, away from the camp, but close enough for him to return quickly with news of the outcome. Morning Sky provided a small medicine pouch to hang around Isabella's neck. Protection, she explained, against both physical and spiritual dangers on the journey. As twilight approached on her final evening in camp, Isabella found herself sitting beside the medicine woman's fire, watching flames dance in patterns that seemed to hold messages she couldn't quite decipher. Rising Star sat nearby, uncharacteristically subdued. "Will White Girl return?" "The Apache," Child asked finally. Voicing the question that hung in the air between them, Isabella twisted her father's watch chain around her finger, a habit that had persisted despite her transformation in other ways. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have family in Santa Fe, my father's sister. I've never met her, but she's my only blood kin now." Morning Sky spoke softly in Apache, which Rising Star translated with unusual solemnity. "Grandmother says blood of body speaks loud, but blood of spirit speaks louder. Says path divides before White Girl's feet. One leads to forgotten past, one to unexpected future." The old woman reached out, taking Isabella's small hand in her gnarled one, turning it palm up to study the lines etched there. She traced one particularly deep crease with her finger, nodding as if confirming something she already suspected. "Two rivers flow in your spirit now," Rising Star translated. "White River, Apache River. One day they join as one strong current." "The medicine," woman released Isabella's hand. "Until then, child must listen to heart's voice, not others' shouts." Before Isabella could respond to this cryptic guidance, Tahoka appeared at the edge of the firelight. The past 2 weeks had seen a subtle shift in his manner toward her. The initial wariness giving way to a quiet regard that felt in some indefinable way like respect. "We leave at first light," he said. "Path is long. Must start early." Isabella nodded, rising to her feet. "I'll be ready." As she turned to go, Rising Star suddenly darted forward and pressed something into her hand. A small bracelet woven from horsehair and decorated with tiny blue beads. "For remembering," she said simply, then stepped back into the shadows before Isabella could respond. Tahoka watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. As they walked back toward the wiki-up they had shared as guardian and charge, he finally spoke. "Child has made place here," he observed. "Not easy thing for white skin among the people." "Your people have been kinder than I expected," Isabella admitted. "Kinder than many white people would be to an Apache child in their midst." Tahoka considered this. "Perhaps. But you speak true words. Show respect for our ways. Learn instead of teach." A rare hint of warmth touched his voice. "Brave heart in small body. Apache respect this above all things." Morning brought clear skies and a solemn departure. The camp gathered to witness their leaving. An honor, Isabella understood, was normally reserved for warriors going to battle or hunt. Grey Hawk presented her with a small carved token bearing the mark of his band, a bird in flight. "Show this if you return," he said, pressing it into her palm. "Guards will know you come in peace." Several of the women who had taught her various skills stepped forward with small gifts: a woven grass doll, a pouch of dried berries for the journey, a pair of moccasins decorated with especially fine quillwork to replace her now worn pair. Even Stone Arm approached, grudging respect evident in the nod he offered before stepping back. The farewells complete, Isabella mounted the small pony Tahoka had prepared. He would lead on foot, as he had when they first journeyed to the camp, tracking and guiding with the skills that had earned him his name. They departed as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, following a different path than the one that had brought them. They traveled in companionable silence for several hours, Tahoka occasionally pointing out tracks or signs Isabella might have missed: a fox's passing, the distant flight of eagles, the subtle indications of water nearby. By midday, they had descended from the higher elevations of the summer camp into rolling foothills covered in juniper and scrub oak. During a brief rest beside a spring, Isabella finally voiced the question that had troubled her through the morning's journey. "What if the soldiers don't believe me?" she asked. "What if they still try to attack the camp?" Tahoka tested the air, assessing the direction of the breeze before responding. "Grey Hawk has already moved women, children to sacred caves. Warriors prepare defenses if needed." His dark eyes met hers. "But soldiers will believe. You are White Judge's daughter. Speak with authority even in child's voice." "And what about you?" she pressed. "Will you be safe when they see you with me?" Something almost like amusement flickered in his expression. "Shadow does not stay for soldiers to see. Guide you to ridge above their path. Watch from distance. Better for all if blue coats think white girl escapes Apache camp alone." The logic was sound, if somewhat disheartening. Even if Isabella convinced the soldiers of the truth that Tahoka had saved rather than kidnapped her, his presence might still trigger hostility and suspicion simply because of his heritage. They continued their journey through the afternoon, Tahoka setting a pace that challenged Isabella's endurance, but remained within her growing capabilities. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, he led them to a high vantage point overlooking a narrow valley. "There," he said, pointing to a distant dust cloud moving slowly along the valley floor. "Soldiers come. You meet them tomorrow at river crossing below." Isabella studied the dust cloud, a strange mixture of emotions coursing through her. Relief at the prospect of returning to the white world she had been born to, apprehension about leaving the Apache community that had sheltered her, and a deep uncertainty about where her true future lay. They made camp beneath an overhang of a rock, sharing a meal of dried meat and the berries given by the women of the tribe. As darkness fell, stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead, familiar yet somehow different from the stars she had known in Boston. "Will I see you again?" Isabella asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. "After tomorrow, I mean." Tahoka added a small stick to their tiny fire, watching the flames leap higher before responding. "Path ahead. As many turns," he said finally. "Shadow follows where Great Spirit leads." He glanced at her, something softening in his normally stoic expression. "But child who survives desert, lives among Apache, speaks truth to counsel. Such one makes own path." A hint of what might have been pride touched his voice. "Shadow thinks your path crosses mine again someday." The simple statement offered more comfort than any elaborate promise might have done. Isabella nodded, accepting both its uncertainty and its possibility. "I'll look for you," she said simply, "wherever my path leads." Tahoka nodded once, acknowledgement and perhaps promise combined in the gesture. Sleep now. Tomorrow brings new journey. As Isabella settled onto her blanket beneath the star-filled sky, she thought of the long, strange path that had brought her to this moment. The Boston childhood that seemed increasingly distant, the nightmare of the Stagecoach massacre, the desperate days alone in the desert, and finally the unexpected sanctuary among people she had been raised to fear. Whatever happened when she met the soldiers tomorrow, whatever path her life took afterward, she knew with sudden clarity that she was no longer the child who had boarded that stagecoach with her father. That girl had vanished as surely as the life she had been traveling toward. In her place was someone new, neither fully of the white world nor truly Apache, but a unique blend of both. A survivor, a bridge between worlds, a child whose future would be determined not by others' expectations, but by her own courageous heart. Morning would bring reunion with her own kind, the beginning of a return to civilization as the white world defined it. But as she drifted towards sleep, Isabella's last conscious thought was of rising stars' parting gift, the horsehair bracelet still circling her wrist, a tangible reminder of the unexpected home she had found in the shadow of the mountains, and the legendary warrior who had led her there when all other paths had disappeared. Dawn painted the eastern sky with ribbons of gold and crimson as Isabella stood alone on the ridge overlooking the river crossing. Tahoka had vanished into the shadows before first light, his final words simple but laden with meaning. Truth has its own power. Speak it without fear. Below, the cavalry patrol approached the crossing. 20 riders in blue uniforms. Dust rising from their horses' hooves as they followed the winding trail. Isabella took a deep breath, clutching the medicine pouch morning sky had given her, and began her descent. Captain James Holloway raised his hand to halt the patrol when he spotted the small figure making her way down the rocky slope. Even at a distance, the sight was extraordinary. A white child in Apache clothing, moving with the deliberate grace of a native through terrain that would challenge many adults. Could it be? His lieutenant murmured beside him. The judge's daughter? Isabella approached the soldiers with her chin high, meeting the captain's startled gaze directly. "I am Isabella Blackwood," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "Daughter of Judge William Blackwood, survivor of the Stagecoach massacre." The next hours unfolded in a blur of questions, explanations, and growing comprehension. Isabella told her story with the unflinching clarity she had learned from the Apache, the attack by Blackburn's gang, her rescue by Tahoka, the truth about who was responsible for the violence blamed on the native peoples. Captain Holloway, a veteran of the frontier with lines of experience etched into his weathered face, listened with growing gravity. "We've suspected Blackburn for some time," he admitted when she finished, "but without witnesses, without proof." "You have both now," Isabella said firmly, drawing her father's gold watch from her belt. "This was stolen from my father's body. Blackburn's men have it and more." A scout was dispatched immediately to Fort McDowell with news of Isabella's survival and the evidence against Blackburn. The remaining soldiers made camp, preparing to escort her to safety once direction came from the fort commander. That evening, as Isabella sat wrapped in an army blanket beside the soldiers' fire, Captain Holloway approached with a letter in hand. "A message arrived last month for your father," he explained. "From your aunt in Santa Fe. I thought you might want to read it." The letter was brief but warm. Margaret Sullivan expressing her excitement about finally meeting her brother's daughter, describing the room she had prepared, the piano she had purchased, knowing Isabella played, the life that awaited in Santa. V Society, Isabella folded the letter carefully, emotions warring within her small chest. The white world beckoned with its comforts and familiarities. A proper bed, books, education, the society she had been born to. Yet her gaze drifted to the mountains, where Tahoka and the Apache camp remained, a different kind of home that had claimed a piece of her heart. 3 days later, a larger contingent arrived from Fort McDowell, led by Major Thomas Harrison. With them came startling news. Blackburn and 3 of his men had been captured at Red Finger Valley, caught with evidence from multiple attacks, including items from the Stagecoach massacre. The ring of raiders who had terrorized the territory for years was finally broken. Your testimony was crucial, Miss Blackwood, the Major told her. You've done a great service to both settlers and the Apache bands, who were unjustly blamed. That evening, as preparations were made for the journey to Fort McDowell, Isabella slipped away from camp. Climbing a small rise, she stood alone beneath the vast desert sky, fingers tracing the horsehair bracelet at her wrist. A whisper of movement in the darkness caught her attention. Tahoka materialized like his namesake, a shadow separating from deeper shadows. "Soldiers believe," he said, approval evident in his voice. "Blackburn captured. Your path opens before you." "2 paths," Isabella corrected softly. "My aunt waits in Santa Fe, but the Apache camp—" She couldn't finish, the conflict within her too complex for words. Tahoka studied her face in the moonlight. "Shadow sees truth. Child stands between worlds now, belongs to both, to neither." His expression softened. "Choose path that calls to spirit, not just to blood." He reached into his pouch and withdrew a small object that gleamed dully in the starlight. A silver pendant on a leather cord, Apache symbols etched into its surface. "Greyhawk sends this," he explained, placing it in her palm. "Says no matter which trail feet follow, Apache spirit walks with white child who spoke truth when others spoke lies." A rare smile touched his scarred face. "Says when child becomes woman, Apache nation remembers its daughter." Before Isabella could respond, he melted back into the darkness, leaving her with the pendant clutched in her small hand and tears tracking silently down her cheeks. 5 days later, Isabella stood on the porch of an elegant Santa Fe home, her aunt's arm around her shoulders as they watched the cavalry escort depart. She wore a proper dress again, though moccasins still covered her feet, hidden beneath the hem. Around her neck hung Morning Sky's medicine pouch, and at her wrist, Rising Star's bracelet remained. "We'll make a proper young lady of you again." "In no time," Margaret Sullivan said kindly, misinterpreting the source of her niece's tears. Isabella smiled but said nothing, her hand rising to touch the silver pendant that lay hidden beneath her collar. Her aunt could not understand that proper no longer held the same meaning for her, that the young lady she had been had vanished forever in the desert heat. She would live in this world, learn its ways anew, fulfill the destiny her father had envisioned. But part of her spirit would always dwell in the shadow of the mountains, with the people who had taught her to survive, to speak truth, to find strength in the most desperate circumstances. And someday, when she was old enough to choose her own path completely, the mountains would call her back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.